In part 1 of why Yoda's true purpose is to teach Luke and Rey the dark side, I set out the reasons for why Yoda's true purpose can only be accomplished through his use of the great gift given to him by the Force Priestesses. That is, through his use of the knowledge of how to manifest his consciousness after death in the form of a Force ghost. I won't go over every point that was made in part 1, but looking at Qui-Gon and the Force Priestesses' words to Yoda in the final arc from Season 6 of the Clone Wars TV series, it's clear that Yoda's destiny is one that will require him to utilize the ability to retain his consciousness after death, which is a condition that's necessary to help save the galaxy from a great imbalance. As we concluded in part 1, it just makes no sense that Yoda would be granted the great gift, undergo all of the trials from the Force Priestesses, and then never utilize his ability to manifest his consciousness after death in any meaningful way, as all of his efforts in regard to Luke and his training as a Jedi to confront Vader and the Emperor were all done while Yoda was alive and before his death. The extent of Yoda's use of becoming a Force ghost can't possibly be the closing of Return of the Jedi. Here in part 2, I'll explain the second part to the equation. Not only is Yoda's true purpose to teach Luke and Rey as a Force ghost, his purpose will be to specifically teach them to understand and use the dark side of the Force. In many ways, this is a much more difficult premise to accept on its face, as while it's initially understandable that Yoda will have a role to play in Luke and Rey's journey through his ability to appear as a Force ghost, it isn't so clear why Yoda would connect with the dark side in this way. Although Yoda may continue to uncover the endless mysteries of the Force and continue his philosophical evolution in this regard, how would Yoda, as the Avatar of Light, the former Grandmaster of the Jedi Order, the one who rejected anything associated with the dark, come to understand the role for the dark side in a Jedi's life? To understand how Yoda will come to these conclusions, it will again be necessary to look at Yoda's final arc from Season 6 of the Clone Wars, wherein he undergoes his trials presented by the Force Priestesses to learn the great gift of manifesting his consciousness after death. As we'll come to see, the basis for these trials given by the Priestesses represented the need for Yoda to let go of his failed philosophy regarding the Force, and really the failed philosophy of the entire Jedi Order, wherein only the light side is accepted, and anything even approaching the dark side is outright rejected and avoided. But before we look at Yoda's trials with the Force Priestesses, and how they would push him into learning how to accept the nature and the existence of the dark side, I want to quickly look at some examples within the current canon that would explain why a character who had only dedicated himself solely to the light for centuries would now, apparently all of a sudden, accept the dark. In part 1, I discussed Yoda's quote to Qui-Gon in the Revenge of the Sith novelization following his defeat to Darth Sidious, wherein Yoda states, "An infinite mystery is the Force, much to learn there still is." As we are exceedingly seeing, the canon is quickly demonstrating that part of these infinite mysteries regarding the Force includes an acceptance of balance that looks at the totality of the Force in its composition of both the light and dark sides. Although I've discussed these examples in greater detail in a handful of other works, I want to again briefly mention them here as examples that would make it easier to accept that Yoda would begin to acknowledge the necessity of incorporating the dark side within Jedi philosophy. The Bendu, a character who represented the center of the Force between the light and dark sides, and who seems to have suggested in the Season 3 finale of Rebels that the Jedi's singular dedication to only the light made them vulnerable to attack not just from the Sith, but from the Force itself. The Guardians of the Wills, inclusive of Chirrut, who believed in the totality of the Force, both its light and dark components, and who respectfully disagreed with the Jedi approach of emphasizing the discord between the light and dark. The Journal of the Wills, with its verse that states that the difference between the light and darkness can only be made right through the resolving of gray, through balance between the two sides. The Sunset Prayer of the Guardians of the Wills, which suggests that individually the light and dark do not bring life or fulfillment. Rather, it's the Force, in its totality and which is eternal, that does so. The collected poems, prayers, and meditations on the Force, which was edited by a disciple of the Wills, wherein its writing suggests the need for accepting both the light and dark sides of the Force, not merely only one of its components while excluding the other. And finally, and please note that these are only a handful of my favorite examples, there's Luke's words to Rey in the Episode 8 teaser that suggests that he has come to conclude, or at least suspect, that the balance between the light and dark is larger than each of its components on its own. Therefore, given the wide range of examples within the current canon, many of them being philosophical and scholarly writings that have come to accept and acknowledge the totality of the Force, and the error in looking at it in terms of only the light side and only the dark side, it isn't so bizarre or extraordinary that Yoda would use the great gift given to him by the Force Priestesses to discover the error in Jedi philosophy that promoted only the light and rejected the dark in its entirety. But I now want to demonstrate how the 3 trials presented to Yoda by the Force Priestesses in order to prove that he was worthy of learning how to become a Force Ghost were all intended to cause Yoda to realize that he was wrong to have committed the Jedi Order on a path that accepted only the light and rejected anything that even approached the dark side. As we'll see, what Yoda learned through these trials, and then what he witnessed following his death in regard to Luke and Anakin's redemption, will form the basis for Yoda learning to accept the need for balance in the Force, and understanding both its light and dark side components once he has become a Force Ghost. He will then use what he has learned to undertake his true purpose in teaching Luke and Rey to utilize the dark side. Having journeyed to meet the Force Priestesses on the Wellspring of Life, the Priestess Serenity begins to explain Yoda's first trial to him. She states that at death, in order for Yoda to preserve his consciousness and manifest himself as a Force Ghost, he must know himself, his true self. Serenity then brought Yoda to an island, which, as she describes it, contained everything that has remained unconquered by Yoda regarding his true self, most notably Yoda's fear. Importantly, before embarking on the first trial, Yoda tells Serenity that he's a Jedi Master, and therefore, he already knows everything that dwells within him, and that he has conquered his fears. Unconvinced, Serenity tells Yoda that he must travel to the island to face his evil and defeat it. Having traveled to the island, Yoda is confronted by his own internal dark side. Initially, as the dark side explains that he's merely what exists within Yoda, the Jedi Master denies this, and states that he doesn't recognize the dark side. Importantly for our purposes here, Yoda's dark side states that he's not only part of Yoda, but part of all that lives. As the dark side takes the upper hand in their fight, and appears to approach to deliver the final blow of the duel, Yoda finally comes to realize that he does recognize the dark side as part of him. However, Yoda confirms that through his own patience and training, he's the one who controls the dark side, and that the dark side does not control him. With that, Yoda understands that the figure is his own dark side, and in rejecting it, he banished his dark side from the island. Importantly, following Yoda's successful completion of his first trial, Serenity tells him that he has conquered his hubris, as what he saw upon the island was a reflection of Yoda's hubris that lay within the shadow of his soul. When Yoda states that he thought he had completely rid himself of his hubris and his dark side, Serenity tells him that the beast is him, and he is the beast. To deny that truth simply gives the dark side power over him. Therefore, this first trial given to Yoda by the Force Priestesses is crucial to understanding why Yoda's true purpose will be to train Luke and Rey to acknowledge and utilize the dark side following his death as a Force Ghost. As Yoda learns in this first trial, the tenets of Jedi philosophy are completely at odds with the reality of the Force and its operation within all living beings. Even Yoda, the Order's own Grandmaster and the best product of Jedi training, can't completely rid himself of his own internal darkness. It was Yoda's hubris, and really the hubris of the entire Order at the end of the day, that caused them to believe that they could control the Force to such an extent that they would only have to serve the light and could completely dismiss and reject the dark side. But as Yoda learned in the first trial, That's not how the Force works. The dark side is present in all living things, including Jedi, no matter what they practice or train to believe. And more than that, as Serenity makes it clear to Yoda, this type of belief and hubris only works to give the dark side power. Therefore, Yoda would have to come to understand that at the very least, the Jedi's philosophical approach to the Force is wrong, given that what they are doing is literally making the dark side more powerful. This would explain Yoda's philosophical evolution between Episode 3 and Episode 5 that we discussed in Part 1, which was noted by Dave Filoni, and which should be pretty clear to viewers as well. But here is the most important point to the first trial undertaken by Yoda in regard to his eventual teaching of the dark side to Luke and Rey. Yoda wouldn't have known the true extent of this lesson until after the redemption of Anakin in Return of the Jedi. Although Yoda may have understood that the dark side was part of everything that lives, including himself and other proponents of Jedi philosophy, he was still under the belief before his death that if an individual started down the path of the dark side, forever will it dominate their destiny. That is, there was no coming back, no redemption back into the light, for a Jedi who chose the path of the dark side. We know that this is what Yoda mistakenly believed, as he told Luke as much about Darth Vader just prior to his death. This would have been a fair assumption for Yoda to make, as there was nothing involved in the first trial that suggested that it wasn't true. As far as Yoda knew, the dark side would have control over and dominate those who didn't outright reject it. It wasn't until after Yoda's death, made possible through the ability to manifest his consciousness through the form of a Force ghost, that Yoda would understand that this wasn't true, that somebody could be redeemed back into the light after falling to the dark side. Therefore, Yoda's highest and most coherent understanding of the Force comes after his death, and this understanding is almost entirely opposed to the Jedi understanding. By the end of Return of the Jedi, Yoda would realize, first, that the dark side is part of all living things, even the most ardent of Jedi. Second, to believe the opposite only gives the dark side power. And third, even those who have completely fallen to the dark side and committed the most egregious acts can still be redeemed back into the light. In my opinion, it's with this knowledge that he has achieved only after his death, wherein Yoda's true purpose can begin, only through his utilizing the gift of manifesting his consciousness after death that was provided to him as a Force ghost. This was the real reason for Yoda being chosen by the priestesses to save the galaxy from a great imbalance, with the great imbalance being the continued attempts by those who are Force-sensitive to dedicate themselves to only one aspect of the Force, and reject the other through their own hubris and lack of understanding of the Force's true nature. Through the great gift provided to him by the Force Priestesses, Yoda can take what he learned through his first trial on the Wellspring of Life, and through the example of Anakin, to continue to expand his understanding of the Force, and move away from the errors of Jedi dogma. This would allow Yoda to eventually accept that which was understood by the characters and groups that we looked at earlier in the video, namely, that the totality of the Force is what should be served, not merely its components of light or dark. Because Yoda learned in his first trial, and with the example of Anakin, that the dark side can never be completely excluded from any living entity, that attempting to do so only empowers the dark and diminishes the light, and that individuals can use the dark side without it dominating their destiny, and they can once again come back into the light, I believe that we'll see Yoda accept that the Force in its totality must be served. This would require Jedi to understand the nature of the dark side, and to even utilize it during times that it's required. Therefore, Yoda will actually come to utilize the great gift given to him by the Force Priestesses to fulfill his most important purpose, which will be to further develop his understanding of the totality of the Force, darkness included, and help to train Luke and Rey understand the nature of the dark side.